Welcome to Better Than Before. This series is a collaboration with CANARI, the Caribbean Natural Resources Institute, with funding from the Open Society Foundations. We are exploring how to build back better from the COVID-19 pandemic, supporting the Caribbean's transition to socially inclusive, climate resilient, and environmentally sustainable development. I am your host, Durval Bazi, founder of the Climate Conscious podcast. Today's special guest has over 25 years' experience in environmental governance and management across the Caribbean. She is currently Executive Director of the Caribbean Natural Resources Institute, CANARI, and has also held positions in other nonprofit organizations, as well as government, private sector, and academia. A conservation biologist by training, she has worked on participatory governance and management of terrestrial and marine ecosystems, green and blue economies, civil society space and strengthening, rural livelihoods, and local green-blue enterprises, building resilience to climate change and natural disasters, and environmental and climate justice. She has developed, managed, and executed research, capacity building, and processes for participatory policy development, planning, and monitoring and evaluation. She is a passionate advocate on Caribbean sustainable development issues at global and regional fora. An experienced facilitator, she has facilitated many multi-stakeholder processes ranging from engaging local community resource users to supporting negotiators in global policy processes. Welcome to Better Than Before, Nicole Leotaud.
Hi, Durval. Thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to be able to chat with you.
Thank you, Nicole. Thanks for joining me for the launch of this series. I am glad that we have the opportunity to share with our audience about CANARI, the work that it does, and the people it impacts. So tell us about CANARI.
So CANARI, or the Caribbean Natural Resources Institute, was formed since 1989. So we're more than 30 years old, and we're a non-profit, completely independent technical institute working across the entire Caribbean. So our mission is to promote and facilitate stakeholder participation and collaboration in stewardship of renewable natural resources in the Caribbean. What that means is we believe people need to be part of the process of managing the rich natural resources in the Caribbean to ensure that it delivers benefits to them, well-being, Caribbean development. That means our work has a few areas of focus. One is building resilience to climate change and natural disasters. Another is facilitating conservation, sustainable use, and restoration of biodiversity and ecosystems, which of course are essential to support Caribbean development. We also champion equity and justice in meeting the environmental and livelihood needs of poor and vulnerable people. And we enable participatory governance of natural resources. So we have many areas of work, as you hear, but ultimately we're about bringing people into the process of managing our natural resources.
Thanks for sharing that, Nicole. And it's so interesting to note that CANARI is 30 years old. I'm sure that, throughout the journey, the organization has seen a lot of changes, a lot of developments, and has been working in these various areas to advance sustainable development within our region. And we can see just how it's important to have people involved.
Yes, certainly. So this conversation we are having today, I think is so important because it helps us to reach out and involve more people in the conversation, in the journey.
Yes. And I'm very pleased to be partnering with CANARI on this series, which aligns so well with the intention of the Climate Conscious podcast, which is to amplify Caribbean voices. When I started the show 2 years ago, the aim was to bring more people into the conversation around climate action and sustainable development. The objective has always been to unpack these big critical issues through a Caribbean lens, which often differs from a global north or a developed world perspective. Frankly, our lived experience is different. It is unique and it's also worthy of an accurate and meaningful representation when addressing global issues. And who better to tell our story and address our problems than us? So, Nicole, bringing the focus to the series that we're launching today, Better Than Before. We're looking at the COVID-19 pandemic and how it intersects with the work that CANARI has been involved in over the past 30 years. So the COVID-19 pandemic was a tipping point for the world. It seemed like almost overnight, a novel virus began to rapidly spread. There were supply chain disruptions and crashes in the world's largest economies. And we saw that cities that never sleep were being sent into lockdown. It was unprecedented and devastating, resulting in serious economic and social fallout, and also serving as the catalyst that brought many underlying issues to the surface. While there were significant losses in terms of human and economic and social capital, at the same time, we saw that nature seemed to get a reprieve from the constant man made pressure. So, Nicole, if you take a look back at the events from March 2020 to now, what was the most striking thing about how the pandemic unfolded in our region?
It seems like such, old history now, but what was so striking for me is the isolation that Caribbean people felt due to the lockdowns and social distancing. And I think it was very distressing for people who are accustomed to being together and are so warm. And what was striking to me is then we shifted to using virtual technologies, the Zoom platforms, the Skype, the whatever, to keep connected or to try and keep connected and stay together. And it actually enabled some of us to be more connected than we were before. We built our technological capacity and our skills in using all these different online platforms. But now, I wonder, we're able to reconnect now a little bit more. We still have to be careful, obviously, but there's nothing like the face-to-face connections among people to build and strengthen relationships. And so it's great that we still have this technology to keep us connected, but I feel we need to remember that people need that human contact, and that's what the Caribbean is really about, So I hope we don't forget that, and we keep locked in our little rooms and work at home and don't reconnect.
And I think we're very grateful that we did have the virtual platforms to turn to. But as you said, it's really no substitute for real life connection and face-to-face interactions. And definitely we need more of that as we tackle the challenges before us. So what prompted CANARI to embark on promoting inclusive and green and resilient COVID-19 recovery in the Caribbean?
So those of us working in sustainable development, very early in the pandemic when it hit, were really emphasizing that COVID-19 was just one crisis facing the world, and it was really part of multiple intertwined crises. So we have biodiversity collapse, we have climate change, we have poverty, and so many social and economic crises that are all connected. CANARI, for a long time, has been promoting the need to change our approach to economic development. We've been promoting that natural ecosystems need to be recognized as a key resource for economic development. We need to protect, conserve, and sustainably use. We have been promoting that poor and vulnerable people, in particular, need to benefit from development, need to have economic opportunities. And we have been promoting that climate change is such a huge threat that building resilience needs to be at the center of all of our development thinking. So we've been working in this way for decades. But what happened with COVID-19 is governments, international partners, everyone began talking about the investment needed to recover from COVID-19 recovery, stimulus packages to help people recover, both in the short term, the immediate relief, but also the longer term. And so this investment then became an opportunity to rethink and reimagine Caribbean development so we could build back better. And we heard this kind of language globally, rethinking how we use energy, shifting from oil and gas to renewable energy, rethinking our relationship to nature, rethinking our focus on building resilience of poor and vulnerable people. So this rethinking was very important, and CANARI was very interested in seeing to what extent Caribbean governments and Caribbean people were doing this rethinking and really transforming development through the many COVID-19 recovery packages that they were announcing.
And I think now most, if not all, stakeholders recognize that economic development without the other elements of environmental sustainability and social well-being will not work. It is destined to fail. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic really brought that to light. But the challenge is like, how do we, get those decision makers and those persons with responsibility to move past just that awareness and to truly implement or take action. As you mentioned, we have the opportunity now to rethink and reimagine as we are making investments and ensuring that those investments support that marrying of economic, environmental, and social priorities. So to this end, CANARI has developed an analytical framework to assess COVID-19 recovery responses in the Caribbean. Can you tell us about the analytical framework, how it works, and what it hopes to achieve?
Thanks, Deval. So yes, talking about reimagining and rethinking and transforming development, commitment to sustainable development, we need to really understand exactly what that looks like. And as a technical institute, CANARI was therefore interested in research and really teasing that out. So what we did is we tried to define an analytical framework that would explain what that transformation looked like. So we looked at 4 areas. We looked at transforming economic governance, how decisions are made. We looked the second area at supporting fairness, inclusion, and justice in economic development. Thirdly, we looked at supporting environmental sustainability as part of recovery. And finally, enabling a low carbon transition and building resilience to climate change and other risks. So together, these 4 areas we felt would help to define what Build Back Better could look like. Across those 4 areas, we identified 18 specific indicators. So these are specific actions that would tell us whether we were committing to building back better as part of COVID-19 recovery. So having this analytical framework now and understanding what CANARI thought could help us to understand building back better looked like, then we did desk research of 6 countries and at the regional level to say what were governments announcing as COVID-19 recovery. So the countries we looked at were Antigua and Barbuda, Barbados, Guyana, Jamaica, St. Lucia, Trinidad and Tobago, and then many Caribbean level regional initiatives. We looked at what was publicly available, published on websites and so on, whether it was a national recovery plan or a budget statement, a speech by a minister. And what we actually found is 412 public sector recovery initiatives. So these are initiatives by government. We didn't look at what the private sector and civil society were doing. We were interested in looking at government investment in COVID-19 recovery. So 412. And we really then mapped each of these initiatives to say, how were they committed to building back better in the 4 areas and under the 18 indicators we had. So a massive piece of research there. But the findings were really quite interesting. We found that 41% of those 412 public sector COVID-19 recovery initiatives were aligned with building back better, those 18 indicators that we had identified. But 5% of them we actually would consider a brown. So they have a negative impact on moving to green, inclusive, and resilient development. So, for example, governments continue to commit to mass tourism and the oil and gas industry, which have proven many issues related to non-sustainable development. Overall, we found some interesting positive areas that Caribbean governments were investing in as part of COVID-19 recovery. So there were investments in digitization and technological innovation. There were commitments to conservation of water resources, better waste management and recycling, reducing land and soil degradation. Governments were talking about and putting initiatives in place to mainstream environmental sustainability concerns in key economic sectors like tourism and agriculture, industry. They were talking about using nature-based solutions or using ecosystems as part of development. Strong, very strong support for local, small, and micro enterprises. So small business, micro businesses getting supported and getting capacity building. Another positive area we saw was investment in, for example, young people and women and reskilling them to be able to work in new green sectors like green agriculture and renewable energy, training them, giving different kinds of support to enterprises. Caribbean governments were committed to enhance access to renewable energy and energy efficient technologies. And some governments were also setting up interesting financial and fiscal mechanisms to be able to fund this. For example, debt for climate swap fund being explored by Antigua and Barbuda, reform of Trinidad and Tobago's Green Fund, and so on. So there were many positive initiatives that we saw being announced by the government that could contribute to this Build Back Better from COVID-19 recovery. But we did find some important gaps and areas for improvement. So for example, really including nature in economic and the value of natural ecosystems in economic decision-making, we are not seeing at all yet. Very limited moves towards enhancing stakeholder involvement and participatory approaches to economic decision-making, including monitoring and evaluation of COVID-19 recovery plans. Very limited attention to managing ecosystems at the big scale, across big landscapes, transboundary, across different countries and territories. Still, the thinking is quite small and limited. Limited attention to strengthening social protection systems, supporting poor and vulnerable people. Limited attention to redesigning education, health, and social development systems to better support inclusion, equity, wellness, and well-being of citizens. Limited attention to development of climate-resilient infrastructure. So overall, we saw some positives in that the COVID-19 recovery initiatives announced by Caribbean governments could contribute to this building back better, but there were gaps that we identified.
Well, I must commend CANARI for undertaking local-based research in terms of evaluating what was proposed by governments in the region and identifying those gaps. It's good that at least 41% of those measures are aligned with building back better. But as you highlighted, there are some gaps that we need to close. So the question is, how do we close those gaps? And I guess the first step is to identify those gaps so that we can then decide what strategies we can take. But definitely this tool is very useful in terms of assessing where we are and charting a way forward.
Exactly. Remember, it was just desk research of initiatives which were announced up to April 2022. And so CANARI hopes that this initial mapping will then reveal information, help stakeholders to do a deeper assessment on COVID-19 recovery in the Caribbean. And what we want to see is informed, open, inclusive discussion and debate where Caribbean people can have a meaningful voice and be part of the discussion on how we can transform and build back better to have a more environmentally sustainable, inclusive, just, and resilient development. CANARI's consultations with stakeholders reveal that what they want to do now is relook at where we are in the region in implementing COVID-19 recovery plans. Remember, what CANARI looked at was merely the initiatives which were announced. So we still need to understand, well, what is being implemented? How is that going? What are we learning? And therefore, we can now relook at our COVID-19 recovery plans, identify where we might need to refocus, reprioritize those to achieve this building back better in the medium and long term. There's a lot of focus on the short-term recovery, but I think we need to make sure we are looking long-term transformation. And what stakeholders are telling us is this process needs to involve them, that COVID-19 recovery decision-making really needs to have stakeholder involvement in the decision-making about what are the priorities, in the process of how can civil society, private sector, others partner with government for implementation, and then in the monitoring and evaluation of what's actually being achieved. So stakeholders are really interested in being part of the process. And I think that's where this research can just help to stimulate the conversations, the dialogues, the debates, and then hopefully the action moving forward.
Nicole, you may have answered this question, but I wanted to ask specific examples of how the framework has been used to enhance the post-COVID recovery action.
Yes, I think this research really is looking at stimulating dialogue and debate. And that process is still ongoing. It's very early days still. And what we hope to do is publish the research, share the findings, then stakeholders in countries would be able to have conversations with their governments among each other to see how they can move forward with COVID-19 recovery, how they can be involved in the process, how they can be involved in monitoring, implementation, how they can be involved in action. We're still at that point of trying to get the information we've gathered out to help support Caribbean stakeholders.
I think one of the good things about the framework is that it clearly shows the multidisciplinary nature of recovery. Like it's not just an economic issue, it's not just a health issue, but there's so many layers and so many sectors that intersect if we are really to have a good chance of a positive recovery.
Exactly.
Yeah, and when we're speaking recovery, we're not just talking about short term, as you mentioned. It's thinking long term, it's thinking intergenerational, it's thinking about, the investments we make today, the decisions we take today, how are they going to affect our future, but also generations that are coming after us.
Exactly, Duval. So it's so important that we take this long-term view. And I think in the Caribbean and indeed the world, we were all really concerned about the immediate impact on people losing their jobs, the health impacts, obviously, the social impact, the impacts on mental health, the impacts on children not able to go to school. So the focus of governments, understandably, was on this relief measures, the immediate short-term actions. And I think those have been well developed now and have been implemented. And we really need to take a pause and say, are we understanding the impact this crisis had, not just on health, but environment, social systems, our economies? And we need to take a pause and rethink our approach to development.
So, in addition to the analytical framework, what are some of the other key activities and results that have been produced or are in the pipeline with CANARI?
We're continuing to support people in rural communities to develop local green blue enterprises. So these are businesses in rural communities that deliver economic benefits for people, but also benefits to the communities and the environment. This is a big program of work we have that we're continuing. Another example is we are continuing to work with governments and local communities on how they can use natural resources to build their resilience to climate change. So some people call this nature-based solutions, replanting mangrove, restoring coral reefs, reforestation, all of these ways that nature can help us build our resilience to climate change. That work is continuing. CANARI is working with some governments in the region to look at how we can better understand the economic value of natural ecosystems and the contribution to economic development, and therefore how governments should be thinking about protecting ecosystems as part of development in our islands. We're also continuing our work to support the wonderful civil society organizations working on the ground across the Caribbean who are protecting, conserving, and finding ways to sustainably use ecosystems and to provide livelihood benefits to local communities. So even while we do this research on initiatives, and we're talking about policies and plans, it's very important to remember that work on the ground also is needed, and we need to make this happen now and not just talk about it.
Yes, and I think that CANARI is well placed to bridge the gap between high level policies and high level decision makers and work that happens on the ground. And I think if it's one thing that we should all take away from this discussion is that recovery and development is not just about protecting profits, but it's about protecting people, especially those that are underserved and marginalized, and also protecting our ecosystems. And it's based on the belief that we can do all of it together, that we don't have to, yes, there are trade-offs, but we can't prioritize one over the other, which we may have done in the past, but now we recognize the need to maintain those three key priorities in terms of economic, environment, and social well-being as we seek to move the region forward.
Deval, I couldn't agree more. And I always remember the little buzzwords used with the Sustainable Development Goals framework of people, planet, and prosperity, that are really at the core of sustainable development we're talking about for decades. And of course, it's challenging to deliver that. As you said, the trade-offs are significant, but I completely agree with you that we need to involve people in those conversations. And it's really governments working with private sector, with civil society, those three groups coming together and really discussing and negotiating and coming up with a shared vision and priorities for Caribbean development at the regional, national, and local level.
Yes. And CANARI and its partners are amplifying local voices for a just and resilient COVID-19 recovery. And in this series, we engage in dialogue with a diverse group of stakeholders, persons involved in academia, business, conservation work, and gender, discussing the desired transformation. We're redefining sustainable development in the Caribbean and sharing our biggest takeaways from the COVID-19 pandemic. As we focus on building back and building back better than before, what is on your wish list for accelerating the transition to sustainable, inclusive, and resilient development in the Caribbean?
So I think my wish list, I think core to transforming our approach to development is transforming our approach to governance. And accelerating the transition really means leveraging the power of all parts of society, of government, private sector, civil society, really leveraging that power so that we commit to a shared vision for change and we work together to achieve that change. So, in a practical sense, this means looking at new types of partnerships that can deliver real change on the ground. And I heard so much commitment from civil society organizations that they want to be part of the solution. They want to be part of the discussions on shaping our recovery pathways, but also in delivering action on the ground. And so certainly I know we have people in the Caribbean ready to work together, but developing that shared vision is important across sectors, across different groups. And I think we need to see Caribbean people in the driver's seat. So development has to be by people, for people, and with people, very simply. And that's my real wish.
What's clear is that we cannot afford to do things business as usual. And one theme that runs through the series is connections. So, post pandemic recovery, the climate crisis, equity and inclusion, economic security, and social well being are all intertwined. And earlier in the discussion, Nicole, you mentioned the multiple crises that are all intertwined. So, therefore, our solutions must be interconnected as well. So, any solution and every action must be aligned with the principles of fairness, resilience, and sustainability. While we hope to never have to live through another pandemic, the possibility is not far fetched. Some even say that the pandemic was a dress rehearsal for the climate crisis. Therefore, what we do now will determine how we are able to respond in the future and how the future generations are positioned to respond. What is required is not just recovery, but radical transformation to rebuild the Caribbean better than before. So, with that, Nicole, how can listeners connect with CANARI?
Deval, we would love for listeners to get involved in the conversation, share their thoughts, be part of a bigger movement in the Caribbean for this transformation. And CANARI is online at canari.org, very simple. We're also on some social media platforms. We're on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube at CANARI Caribbean. So we'd love to hear from people and hope that they can follow us on our online platform.
Thank you so much for listening to the Better Than Before series. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. For more info, or if you'd like to share your questions and ideas directly with us, please connect with CANARI and the Climate Conscious Podcast on any of our social media platforms. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and my personal favorite, LinkedIn. See show notes for direct links to our websites. The Better Than Before series is a production of the Climate Conscious Podcast in collaboration with CANARI, funded by the Open Society Foundations. This series is edited and produced by Bradford Media, with artwork by Carrie Lee Dixon. Join us on the next episode.